I wanted to sort of, ask a question, but also bring in some things that we've heard about today. And so a little bit of filling evident on also what we've been talking about. So, right, we've been thinking about the issue of native speaker and the sort of valorization of nativeness in linguistics, psycholinguistics, and beyond. And so we've heard a range of talks that have, covered this in different ways. And one reason why we invited you and wanted to hear your perspective on acquisition is, first of all, well, there's two pieces. One is that a lot of the sort of assumptions about, why people want to have a quote so-called native speaker group is because of assumptions about how language acquisition works, and a lot of assumptions that maybe are not empirically based. So that's one piece. And then the other piece is that there's this assumption that there's this group that is homogenized, right? That is homogenous, that's idealized, and individual differences research directly pushes against that idea. So I wanted to sort of put those ideas together and give you a chance to sort of say what you think about that as other people are hopefully writing also their questions.
Yeah, interesting question. So I guess let me start with individual differences, right? Because I think that's the something that I have a stronger opinion about. And I guess but I understand how it's also related to the notion of native speaker and the homogenization of that particular concept. So I guess with the individual differences, one thing that is I think we're missing out on, especially in acquisition, and especially when you're looking at very young children, when you see these differences, as you saw in the word bank data, they're so large, right? There's like at 18 months, you can have children who are really, really moving towards good proficiency, right? Can have conversations. And you've got children who really only have a few words, right? And some of those words may be just simply social routines. And so when we're doing studies where we are having an 18-month-old group, and then we're comparing them in a cross-sectional design, which is really, let's face it, the most frequent type of design that people have, because longitudinal studies are really difficult to do. They're also very expensive to run, right? And then we start making inferences to development across those, between those, when we get age effects. When in actual fact, maybe we shouldn't be doing that, right? I think one way in order to get around that, which is something that I've kind of pushed every now and again, and then no one really listens, is why not actually just create groups on the basis, like pre-screen your groups, create groups on the basis of say something like a CDI, and then suddenly you can then try and make better inferences about change, even in cross-sectional designs, because you have a group that has on average 50 words versus a group that has on average 200 words. That takes, for me, I think that's making takes development a little bit more seriously, right? And I can see you've got your own language acquisition device there as well. So.
Yes, I was going to say, yeah, this is number two, one of two right now, who's no words yet, but we'll see.
Yeah, and I guess when it comes then to the notion of, so then I guess that dovetails into this sort of other trickier concept of the native speaker, right? So I know that when, for instance, I think there's a really unfortunate distinction between research that goes on with, I guess, what you could say monolingual children or native speakers versus bilingual speakers or multilingual children. But if you're going to if you're going to make comparisons on the basis of people's language proficiency or their language knowledge, then you don't fully get around the fact that, say, if you had a group of children who are only learning one language versus learning two languages, if you are equating them if you're having one group and you're just saying, we're including all of these all of these individuals, regardless of their language experience, but we're interested in their if you're interested in one language and you're going to create groups on the basis of their knowledge of that language, then you get around, or then you can disregard the notion of native speaker as being important in your research. Yeah. I don't know what the bilingualism people would say about that, but that's not for me to represent them, I suppose. Mm.
So it's been a long day. I'm not seeing any questions yet in the Q&A. But I have many questions of my own, so I can ask another. Um, so another theme that we've talked about a lot is, relating to when we see differences, how we frame those differences, basically, and that we could have a great deal of, and we do have a great deal of variation amongst, these sort of a priori, like, top-down categorically based groups. And then how we then frame those differences really can matter for, people's humanity, but also for our understanding of how, different mechanisms work. So I'm curious about, in individual differences work, particularly in acquisition, how you think about, the framing of those differences, when we're sort of discussing how to talk about it, right? So you talked about like difference versus deficit, for example, and how we see these deficit approaches taken particularly towards minoritized groups in acquisition and beyond. So yeah, it's just, again, a big question, but something that I'm sure comes up a lot when we're talking about these things. Yeah.
Yeah, I think if you make the basic assumption that there's variation, then all variation is part of the normal spectrum, right? And so I think it can be easy to interpret something like saying, for instance, like in the segmentation research, when I was saying that these kids aren't quite there, they're not segmenting words from speech. I think that can be easy to make an assumption, then that could be interpreted as a deficit, but it's certainly not, right? It's just a developmental trajectory, and because there's such wide differences, particularly in development, really, I guess that if it's assumed as a deficit, then it's assumed that there's some kind of normal, but there really isn't. There's a range, and it's really important to really to emphasize that range is there, and that means that I think it's there, and it also means that it really is illuminating, like I said, about the mechanisms of development. So I think it's also important but hard to map all of the reasons why, for instance, those developmental trajectories are the way they are. But at the same time, the promise of understanding those differences is when those differences get to a point that they may be clinically problematic, then they can, such as when children have very low language, then hopefully we have some evidence to be able to identify how those problems could be remediated. But yeah, I think a focus, I guess, just to summarize, a focus on or an assumption of variability means that you are hopefully widening the spectrum of what you think of as typical, right?
Thank you. Yeah, and I think the fact that you were saying, oh, this group is kind of homogenous, but in many ways, high SES, all these different things. But the fact that you see this range in such a group is, for me, all the more illuminating to that very point of there isn't this sort of, anyway, I think that's really exciting.
That's absolutely right. This comes out all the time, actually. So I like arguments about, for instance, input and quantity being related to things like SES is really, I think, not something I ever find, in the sense
Right.
that within these bands you find huge differences.
Thank you. So we do have a question in the Q&A. I'll read it. If I understood you correctly, your studies show that symbolic play, not functional play, facilitates language development. Can you clarify if that was based on child caregiver dyads? If that's the case, would you say that we could find similar or different results from peer dyads or peer groups like siblings, for example? Would that
No,
make a big difference for individual differences? Yeah.
really, thanks for that question. That's a really good one. Um, so these children were really young, so they're 18 months and 24 months, and so the likelihood of having uh, really productive peer play can sometimes be difficult. But I think where the peer play or sibling play would definitely come in is when they're older, right? And so you're right also that we that it was caregiver child play, and that's where we found that the symbolic play context was valuable. We've also looked at things like with meta-analyses of the association between symbolic play and language and found that there is a positive relationship as well, a fairly robust one. So it seems like that context itself is important, at least for the cultures that we've looked at it in. But the other, talking about cross-cultural research, actually a lot of the time in other cultures, majority of the play will be with siblings actually, so one might see a cross-cultural difference in the sense that play may well be peer play or sibling play may be very valuable for children in other cultures.
Thank you. And another, connection to things that we talked about before is the, thinking about when we have these different mechanisms, if you're taking this approach, you sort of expect that different mechanisms or factors will be relevant in different contexts, right? And so that's another sort of advantage, but also relates to contextualized analyses like we've talked about earlier. So I wanted to make that connection. Let me mute for a sec.
Yeah, I'll feel the air. You're exactly right. Yeah, and so these things should emerge differently depending on the combination of different variables that are more or less involved in the life of a child in say cross-culturally. So that's why, for instance, arguments about input quantity don't always are not always that strong in, like, for instance, Marissa Casillas' work in Saltal culture, where and parts of Papua New Guinea as well, where children don't get a lot of direct input, and so they're observing a lot of input, but then a lot of linguistic anthropologists like Lourdes de Leon has shown that these kind of social routines that the children are engaging in are probably a really great foundation of their early language development.
Well, we do have another question. If Evan would be willing.
Okay. Yes.
Yeah.
Sorry.
I know. Yeah, I think people just need a little more time because it's end of day and we're getting there.
Yeah, so, sorry about that. Yeah.
I've just read it.
You got it.
So yeah, I'm happy to answer this question. So I guess the history of the field, when you look at it, we actually published a paper a couple of years back that looked at all of the papers published in the field, which was really interesting. Well, I guess historically as well. And honestly, the history of the field is that it emerged in when people were looking at using naturalistic data for the most part, and they were looking at a few individuals, and it seemed to be that the diversity of the researchers was pretty low. So they were often white middle class or upper class university professors who were often studying their own children, right? And so really a lot of the original work was published in England or the UK and the United States, and that meant that I guess historically there's then this has some knock-on effect, right? So the people who begin the field, so the pioneers of the field, create the boundaries of what is of questions that's worth asking, right? And so there's like a historically contingent sort of accident in a way. So you could think of a thought experiment where you could say, what would happen if it started out in, like parts of India where multilingualism is huge, or parts of Papua New Guinea where people speak regularly 6 languages or something like that. So it just really is the case that that it's my opinion or my feeling is that it's really from this historically contingent accident in a way, which is probably the story of many fields, actually. Mm. Mm.
That is a really great note, I think, to end on, just, and thinking about everything we've talked about today and that we're going to cover again next week all together. I think that's really a helpful way to think about as we think about how to move beyond that, right? Or make real meaningful changes in our practice and theory and beyond.